Imagine booting up a modern version of Windows and slowly realizing that something feels different. Not just visually, but fundamentally. It's not a single feature or update that gives it away, but a pattern. A quiet evolution that's been happening for years. Microsoft isn't announcing it on a keynote stage, and they're certainly not marketing it this way. But when you connect the dots, it becomes clear that Windows is slowly, deliberately, and strategically turning into something that looks a lot like Linux. Not Linux as a brand, not Linux as a replacement, but Linux as a philosophy, a foundation, and increasingly a core dependency. This isn't speculation or fan theory. The proof is already baked into Windows itself, hiding in plain sight. To understand how radical this shift is, you first need to remember the old Microsoft, the Microsoft that famously called Linux a cancer, the Microsoft that built its empire on proprietary software, closed ecosystems, and a strict Windows or nothing mentality. For decades, Windows was designed to be its own world, with its own APIs, its own tools, and its own rules. Developers were expected to build for Windows using Microsoft technologies. System administrators were expected to manage Windows servers using Microsoft tools, and users were expected to live entirely within that ecosystem. Linux, on the other hand, represented everything Windows was not. It was open source, modular, community-driven, and deeply rooted in Unix philosophy. The two worlds barely touched, and when they did, it was usually hostile. Fast forward to today, and the contrast is shocking. Modern Windows now ships with a Linux kernel subsystem built directly into the operating system. This isn't an emulator or a compatibility layer in the traditional sense. This is the real Linux kernel running alongside the Windows NT kernel. Windows Subsystem for Linux, or WSL, started as a clever trick to translate Linux system calls into Windows calls. But Microsoft quickly realized that wasn't enough. Developers wanted real Linux behavior, real performance, and real compatibility. So Microsoft did something unthinkable in the old days. They integrated the actual Linux kernel into Windows. This single decision alone fundamentally changed what Windows is. Once you allow a Linux kernel to run natively inside Windows, you're no longer just borrowing ideas from Linux. You're relying on it. Developers can now run Bash, apt system, Docker, and entire Linux distributions without dual booting or using heavy virtual machines. Ubuntu, Debian, Arch, Fedora, and more can live comfortably inside Windows, sharing files, networking, and even GPU acceleration. For many developers, Windows has effectively become a Linux host with a Windows shell on top. But WSL is just the most obvious piece of evidence. Look deeper, and you'll see Linux influence everywhere. Take Windows Terminal, for example. For years, the Windows command line experience was infamous for being clunky, outdated, and painful to use. Meanwhile, Linux terminals were powerful, customizable, and central to the workflow. Instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, Microsoft embraced the Unix-style terminal culture. Windows Terminal now supports multiple shells, tabs, panes, UTF-8, themes, and GPU-accelerated text rendering. PowerShell itself has evolved to feel more like a modern shell, and it's now open source and cross-platform, running natively on Linux and macOS. The old Windows-only mindset is gone. Microsoft doesn't just tolerate Linux anymore. They design Windows tools to feel at home in a Linux-like workflow. Then for years, Systemed was a defining feature of modern Linux distributions, handling services, startup processes, logging, and more. Windows had its own service management model, completely separate and incompatible. But with the arrival of WSL2, Microsoft made the controversial but deliberate choice to support Systemed inside WSL. That wasn't a small concession. It was an admission that the Linux way of managing services had become the industry standard, especially in cloud and server environments. By embracing Systemed, Microsoft effectively aligned Windows development workflows with Linux server realities. Speaking of servers, this is where the transformation becomes impossible to ignore. Linux dominates the server world, the cloud, containers, and modern infrastructure. Microsoft didn't defeat Linux in the space, they joined it. Azure, Microsoft's cloud platform, now runs more Linux than Windows. That's not marketing spin. That's a business reality. The majority of workloads on Azure are Linux. Microsoft actively contributes to the Linux kernel, not as a hobby, but because their cloud depends on it. Windows Server still exists, but it's no longer the default or even the most popular choice for new deployments. Containers are another massive piece of the puzzle. Docker, Kubernetes, and container-based workflows were born in the Linux world. Instead of pushing a Windows-native alternative, Microsoft embraced these tools fully. Docker Desktop on Windows runs Linux containers by default, powered by WSL 2. Kubernetes support on Windows relies heavily on Linux nodes. Even when you think you're using Windows, chances are your applications are actually running inside Linux containers behind the scenes. Windows has become a host, not the star. Look at the file system, philosophy too. Historically, Windows, paths, permissions, and file handling were completely different from Unix-like systems. Over time, Microsoft has quietly made Windows more Unix-friendly. Case sensitivity is now supported on a per-directory basis. Symbolic links are easier to create and manage. File permission models have been extended to better align with POSIX standards, especially within WSL and developer environments. These changes aren't meant for casual users. They're meant for developers who live in a Linux-first world and expect their tools to behave consistently. Even the way Microsoft distributes software has shifted in a Linux-like direction. The Windows package manager Winget is essentially a native package manager inspired by API, DNF, and pack. Instead of hunting for installers on random websites, users can now install, update, and remove software from the command line using a centralized repository model. This is a core Linux concept that Windows resisted for decades, and now it's officially part of the OS. Open source is another undeniable indicator. Microsoft is now one of the largest contributors to open source projects in the world. .NET is open sourced, PowerShell is open source, Visual Studio Code, arguably the most popular code editor on Linux. macOS and Windows is built with web technologies and openly developed. VS Code feels more like a Linux-first tool than a traditional Windows application, and it's deeply integrated with WSL SSH and container work. Developers can edit code on a remote Linux server, inside a container, or within WSCLA, all from a Windows machine that increasingly acts as a thin client. The UI side of Windows is also quietly borrowing from Linux desktop environments, virtual desktops, advanced window snapping, tiling features, dynamic workspaces, and keyboard-driven workflows all mirror what Linux desktops like GNOME, KDE, and tiling window managers have offered for years. Windows isn't copying one specific desktop, but it's clearly absorbing ideas that originate in the Linux ecosystem, especially ideas that improve productivity for power users. Security is another area where Linux influence is obvious. Windows has adopted sandboxing, mandatory integrity controls, container-based isolation, and virtualization-based security features that resemble Linux security models. The idea of isolating processes, minimizing and hardening the kernel has long been a Linux strength, and Windows is moving steadily in that direction. Even Windows Defender and modern Windows security tools are designed with threat models that assume a Linux-dominated server and cloud environment. Perhaps the most telling proof is not technical at all, but philosophical. Microsoft no longer positions Windows as the center of the universe. Instead, it's positioning Windows as a platform for developers, regardless of what they build or where it runs. Whether you're targeting Linux servers, Docker containers, Android apps, or cloud-native microservices, Windows wants to be the place where you write the code, not necessarily the place where it runs. This is a fundamentally Linux-like mindset. Linux has always been about flexibility, interoperability, and running anywhere. Even gaming, traditionally Windows' strongest territory, is feeling the shift. Valve's Proton has shown that Linux can run Windows games at near-native performance. In response, Microsoft has improved Windows support for Vulkan, DirectX, translation layers, and cross-platform graphics APIs. The line between Windows and Linux gaming is thinner than ever, and Microsoft knows it can't afford to ignore that reality. So is Windows literally becoming Linux? No, not in the sense that it's replacing the NT kernel or open sourcing the entire operating system. But that's not the point. The real transformation is deeper and more strategic. Windows is becoming a Linux-compatible, Linux-inspired environment because that's where the industry has gone. Developers, servers, cloud infrastructure, containers, and modern workflows are overwhelmingly Linux-based, and Microsoft chose adaptation over extinction. The proof isn't a single announcement or feature. It's the accumulation of decisions over years. WSL running a real Linux kernel, Azure running mostly Linux, Docker and Kubernetes baked into Windows workflows, open source tools everywhere, package managers terminals, systemed POSIX compatibility, and Unix philosophy creeping into the heart of Windows. All of it points in the same direction. In the end, Windows isn't being replaced by Linux, it's being reshaped by it. Microsoft has realized that the future doesn't belong to closed, isolated operating systems. It belongs to platforms that can coexist, integrate, and adapt. And in that future, Linux isn't the enemy of Windows. It's the blueprint